long. So I think that's all from me in terms of housekeeping. So we're going to go straight on to the questions, and we're going to start with the candidates going in alphabetical order by surname. So short straw for Andrew, who will be going first. And we're going to start with what I hope is a relatively straightforward question, which is just, why are you better placed to become a member of the House of Lords than the other candidates standing in this election?
Well, I'll talk to my strengths. We'll all talk to our own strengths, but mine, I think, is that I'm an elected councillor. I do represent a constituency. I represent a constituency of people. If I get selected for the House of Lords, I intend to stay being a councillor, and so I'll have a constituency of people just like an MP would. And it's not unusual in our own council. We have Baroness Pinnock, who is also the councillor for Clackheaton, and so she does both roles on the council. I represent. There's one or two other lords as well who are also there. And I think it gives you, in an unelected House of Lords, to have somebody there who has a mandate from actual real people, electors. It is a real advantage because there's loads of people there who are either hereditary or have been appointed by their parties with no reference to anybody. So I think that is a particular advantage. Another advantage is that I've actually initiated and implemented Green Party policy and stuff which has been pioneering in many ways, because it's the first time it's been done. We had the very first ever free insulation scheme in Kirklees. That was a Green Party amendment to the budget, and that was the very first ever such scheme in the country. And over 50,000 homes got insulated, and it became something that other councils took on, and was a groundbreaker. Also, we had the first ever policy in the local plan which effectively banned fracking, and that was approved by the government's planning secretary, which I could talk more about later. But essentially what it meant was that any fracking application any planning application for fracking would have to demonstrate how it would have net zero impact on climate change. And that policy would basically mean that anybody who came to frack in Kirklees would have a very difficult time. And because we got that policy passed, it meant that every other council in the country could use that as well. So a few things there. There's a number of other things I could mention, but I'll shut up for now and give other people a chance.
Thanks, Andrew. So it's now Molly's turn.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks for coming today. So I'm standing on my record as a legislator. We don't have very many people in the Green Party who have actually made laws. Myself, Caroline, Jean and Keith. I think I'm right in saying that's all. And, you know, I was pretty naffed off, to be honest, to be kicked out of the European Parliament when I just regained my place on 18% of the vote. And I've got a T-tail to prove that, because I'm very proud of that. And then I was turfed out because of bloody Brexit. So I was, you know, I've had experience in legislating. I was ready to go back and carry on changing laws. And I would like to be able to use that experience now in the House of Lords. I was the Parliament's rapporteur on sustainable finance, which means I steered through some really complex legislation and, you know, in an area with a lot of technical detail. And that's the kind of work I think would prepare me very well for being the next Green peer. I also think that during my time as an MEP, I showed myself to be somebody who's good at political opportunity spotting. And I think as a Green politician particularly, you have to be quite opportunistic, because very often where the political agenda is not where our agenda is. And we have to see ways to sort of slip in Green policy as we go along. And I think I was quite effective at doing that as an MEP. And it's something else I'd like to carry on doing as a member of the House of Lords. I mean, at the moment, we can see the political situation in this country is pretty disastrous, but there are always opportunities to shame the powerful groups and structures into introducing some Green Party policy. And I'd like to have a chance to do that. So the House of Lords is obviously an amending chamber. It's a chamber that we don't think should exist in its current form. So I'd be delighted to follow the tradition of arriving there and putting down a motion for its abolition. I'm sure my fellow candidates would do exactly the same. But nonetheless, I think we can use the platform there to really take our policy forward and to use that platform to share green ideas more widely. I also think a skill that I have which will be useful as a peer is that I'm good at assimilating complex information in new areas very quickly and being able to apply it. It's something that, you know, basically I was quite a nerd at school, and I think I've always had that skill, and it's served me quite well as an active politician. And lastly, something that's very useful that I learned in the European Parliament is genuinely working in a cross-party way. Because the European Parliament doesn't have nobody has a majority. You always have to build a majority by working with other groups. And so, you know, I learned how to do that, and I learned that actually I was a pretty good negotiator, which I was quite surprised about because I didn't know that I had that skill. But being able to work with other people on something you agree with them about when you disagree with them on a load of other issues is actually something that's really important, and it's kind of key to the culture of working of the House of Lords. So I'll talk later, I'm sure, about my media experience and so on, but just in closing, I'd like to say that I very much admire the work that's been done by both Jenny and more recently Natalie in the House of Lords. I've known them both for a long time, and I'm sure I could work with them very positively, and I'd love to have a chance to do that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Molly. And then finally, Amelia, on this first question.
Thank you. As the Green Party, you've put your faith in me for an unprecedented 3 terms as Deputy Leader. And I want to make sure that if you elect me first preference, that I can go forward and make sure that our unique green values are heard within the House of Lords to the same consistent and clear messaging that I have given as Deputy Leader. As a scientist with the qualifications to back it up, an MSc in environmental technology and an BSc in environmental biology, I want to ensure that we have clear scientific scrutiny in the House of Lords. As Molly's alluded to, we need to, the chamber is about making sure that there's scrutiny, collaboration, and making sure that we're working deeper on those policies. And that scientific basis is so fundamental to make sure that we're addressing the climate and ecological emergency with the tools that we need to ensure that there is clarity and consistency of the change that we want to make. I have worked already on parliamentary committees representing the Green Party. I am already changing the debate when it comes to issues such as women's rights and the environment, where I've worked cross-party already with peers and MPs to make sure that our green policies are heard, and policies such as misogyny as a hate crime have been put onto the political agenda and are now moving through Parliament. I have already changed the national conversation by co-founding Another Europe is Possible, the Left Wing Remain campaign, to make sure that our policies as Greens are being supported, and our vision at that time of Europe was actually being represented within the national debate. In my role as Deputy Leader, I have you all as my constituents, and I will always represent those green values. The role itself, with respect to my predecessors, the role itself wasn't a big role. With very little resource, I have built this to a national profile that is given respect by the press, media, and politicians in a way that nobody else has been able to do. The House of Lords is under-resourced, and I want to be able to continue to bring those experiences into that work, because as Molly says, you do need to be imaginative and innovative about making change happen. And I've worked, as I said, I've worked cross-party to do that, as well as doing things like using my own experiences of domestic violence to talk about specific issues, or more recently working with musicians and artists across the country to talk about why we need a universal basic income for everybody, but specifically why it would benefit the arts at a time when the arts was on the front page of our media, but our policies needed to get heard. I want to, as Molly says, I want to be the first elected person to our second chamber once we've managed to abolish the House of Lords. But in the meantime, I want to make sure that I bring the diversity of a younger voice. We've seen a seismic shift in politics over recent years about whose voices are being heard, and it's women and young people that are showing a political force to be reckoned with, especially when it comes to representing the climate and ecological emergencies. When just 26% of the House of Lords are women and 5% are under the age of 50, I want to make sure that I'm representing the voice of a generation that so often isn't heard, but throughout the world at the moment, we are seeing that representative change, and we are seeing stronger policies as a result. My work has been backed up by recently being shortlisted for Young Politician of the Year, which is an international accolade. And I want to continue to ensure that, as I said, our green message is heard, green scrutiny continues. But personally, I want to make sure that I go in and disrupt a cosy consensus of stuffy chambers.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amelia, and thank you to all of our candidates for answering that first question. For those of you who are watching Facebook, there's just over a dozen of you who are watching this on Facebook now. One thing I'd really love it if you were able to do was if you could share this video, you can comment on it, you can like it, make sure that it appears in more people's feeds, so that we can get as many people to hear from the candidates as possible. We're now going to move on to our second question, which I'm going to be putting to Molly first. So while in the Green Party, policy is set by the membership, its priorities and its key messages are often in part set by the people in positions of public office. So what would your priorities be as a member of the House of Lords? So as I said, I'm going to go to Molly first on that one.
Yeah, so you won't be surprised to hear me returning to the issue of constitutional reform. I think a lot of us in the Green Party realise that, well, we all know we've got an unfair electoral system, and it's an absurdity that we have basically toffs because their, you know, great whatever grandfather killed somebody in the 15th century sitting there making our laws. I mean, and also we don't have a written constitution now. So when we got into the Brexit crisis, essentially Tories were just trying stuff on and getting away with it. And, you know, it needed the Supreme Court to wade in because we don't have a rule book in terms of the constitution. So basically our constitutional arrangements are a total mess. And I think that's got to be a political priority for all Democrats at the moment. So I would prioritise talking about democracy, defending democracy, expanding democracy, bringing more voices in, and especially challenging Labour over their refusal to support a fair voting system. I think that's important for us as Greens, but it's important for everybody because we need a pluralist democracy. We've seen how destructive and sterile and basically anti-democratic the two-party system is. So I've got to say, whatever else I did, that would be a priority for me. But then you won't be surprised to hear me say that I also think I'm going to do a lot about economics. I'm going to respond to Amelia now and say I'm a professor of economics, as you well know. And, you know, that's something I learned how to do that because I could see that the Green Party wasn't treated with authority, although I think our economics policy has always been great. I've only made minor contributions myself. But I think people need to have a lot more courage to go out there and sell our economic policy, and that's something I could do from the House of Lords. And I think people will be surprised to see me doing that. As an MEP, I worked on economics and monetary policy and also on tax policy. And actually our position was closer to the FT's position than any other party. And we got quoted in the FT frequently, Financial Times, sorry. And that's because our policy on tax and finance and banking is the best policy. Greens had more credibility in the European Parliament than anybody else. And I think we need to bring that to the UK because it really frustrates me when people say, oh, you know, you're all very good on climate change, but what about economics? Because we've got the best policies on economics as well. And I want to use the platform of the House of Lords to convince more people of that. And thirdly, I would say a key issue for me is housing. And there's several reasons for that. One is that I've actually been homeless myself, actually pregnant and homeless, and it was the most frightening time of my life, and there was no safety net there to help me at all. And I just don't want other people to have to go through that. I think people underestimate how much your life can be destroyed by not having a safe home. And to me, I think Sean's done brilliant work on housing, but we haven't had anybody in any of the legislators who's really made that a priority. And so that's something I would like to do. And I also think it's an issue that has a particularly strong appeal to young people. And obviously a lot of young people vote for us already, but I think we need to be there fighting for them and for their rights to have a safe home and, you know, for their rights if they're renting as well, and protecting the rights of tenants against the power of landlords. So those are the top three, but you know what I'm like I already said, I'm kind of an enthusiast and an opportunist. So I'm sure I'd find lots of other areas to work in as well, but those would be my top three.
Brilliant, thanks Molly. So over to Amelia on this one second.
So my priority is always a Green New Deal. And I appreciate that that's Green Party policy repackaged, but we have had the best policies on this for 30 years. And that really was 30 years ago was the best time to have put them in place, but the second best time is right now. we are very clear that we have a limited window of opportunity to get those policies in place. And I think it's vital that we have an environmental analysis about what's happening to provide genuine scrutiny when when people like Boris Johnson start appropriating the words that we use, but we make sure that we're able to expose and highlight why we need to be going that step further and have a genuine Green New Deal that lifts people out of poverty, that addresses inequality, and at the same time keeps us below 1.5 degrees of warming. I think the fact that a universal basic income is at the heart of those policies are really vital as well, as a unique way of making sure that there's green policy that can make a genuine difference to people's lives. I think it's also important to represent the Greens as our membership. As Molly says, we do have the best policies, and that's why it's important to be having a Green Lord representing them. But I really pride the work that I've done at the grassroots, going across the country and listening to people on doorsteps. And I think it's really important that we are reflecting that in the work we do. Things like when I worked at Grenfell Tower, being able to listen to that community and submit parliamentary questions through Caroline Lucas meant that we were able to expose a lot of the issues that had happened there and ensure that we had genuine scrutiny. And I want to continue that work of making sure that we are listening and representing communities that are so often failed by government and policies through that role of scrutiny that you have in the House of Lords. I also would say that we need to be making sure that we are looking at policies like the as an End Ecocide campaigner. That's how really I began in my role as deputy leader, having the opportunity to be able to talk about those kind of policies that could make a genuine difference at tackling the ecological emergency as well would be really powerful to make sure that we are protecting the planet and people on it.
Thanks, Amelia. And then finally, Andrew, on this one.
So addressing climate change has got to be top of the list. That's our raison d'etre. It's what we're about, and so for me that is the main thing. Now, Green New Deal is a strong part of that, and so I agree with Amelia on that. One of the things that we're actually lacking at the moment is a plan to achieve the Paris climate goals. We don't have a plan really effectively to do that within the timescales that are required. We should be looking for a zero carbon economy by 2030. That simply doesn't exist. And so job number one has got to be get government to be looking at that. One of the things I did when I was a member of the EU Committee of the Regions, the body that represented local and regional governments of the EU, was I was an attendee of the COP climate talks. I developed a concept when I was working at as a member of the EU Committee of the Regions called locally determined contributions. And this really was a way of helping national governments achieve their targets and go beyond their targets by giving local and regional authorities a role. Now, we had some success with that, and now national governments should involve local and regional authorities when they're drawing up their plans to address climate change. And they're not doing that at the moment. They're simply not working with local and regional bodies, and we need to hold them to account on that. And so that would be something that I would do with my background as a councillor, but also somebody who's influenced global climate policy. So that's a particular job that needs doing now. Housing, completely agree on the housing issue. But very specifically, I want to see an end to the right to buy council housing. I think it's appalling that we're selling off social housing at massively reduced prices. And if anything, we need much more social housing. We want social housing to become an option. Council houses that people can live in and know that they're going to be able to live there for the next 30, 40 years in security. And also to build those houses to passive house standards with very low energy demand. And so housing certainly is important for tackling the climate crisis, but by doing all those things, jobs as well. So jobs, housing, climate, those are my priorities.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all the candidates. For those of you who just recently joined us on Facebook, you're currently watching the Bright Green hustings for the Green Party's House of Lords candidates. We are going to move on to a question that was submitted in advance by a number of people in different ways. But before we do, I just wanted to say, if you do have any questions for the candidates, please do pop them in the chat if you're watching on Zoom. And for those of you who are watching on Facebook, please just comment beneath the video and we can pick those up. So on to our next question. So as I said, this was submitted by quite a number of different people in different sort of forms. So this question is, the Scottish Greens don't take seats in the House of Lords as it's an inherently anti-democratic institution. How do you square being part of a party of radical democracy whilst also wanting to take a seat in an unelected upper chamber? I'm being hit by my lighting there, apologies for that. So if you didn't catch that or distracted, the question is, how do you square being part of a party of radical democracy while also wanting to take a seat in an unelected upper chamber? And I'm going to start with Amelia on this one.
If we don't have an elected second chamber in my lifetime, then we will have failed as Greens and as progressives. And I think that by making sure that we have people in those seats representing that need for democratic reform is the best way to get that reform. I never had an ambition to run for House of Lords. And I think if we're going to have a seat as a party, then we need to be making sure that we send somebody who will effectively be a Trojan horse, somebody that isn't part of the political establishment in the way we understand it, but is able to work with people in a cooperative way and collaborative way. I think that kind of looking at those priorities as well, I think it's really important that we're talking about an anti-austerity agenda as Greens. In the aftermath of coronavirus and the aftermath of Brexit, we need to be making sure that people are not harmed by the failure of government policy, of a broken political order that time and time again has harmed the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. We've seen the House of Lords take on a role of doing that in a way that I certainly hadn't imagined before, and I think has shown that there are aspects of why we need to be making sure we have that second chamber, but why we need to be having clear and voices representing people that have the House of Lords simply as a demographic just does not represent so many parts of society in the country. And I think that by getting that a different voice in, a voice that represents a different generation, a voice that makes sure that we are scrutinising and championing different rights, then we can make sure that we scrutinise government policy in a way that can genuinely make difference for people's lives until we have that elected second chamber and democratic reform that we so vitally need.
Brilliant, thanks Amelia. So Andrew, how do you square being a part of a party of radical democracy whilst also wanting to take a seat in an elected upper chamber?
I agree there's loads wrong with our democracy, and it's not just the House of Lords. The House of Lords is of course an appalling institution that should be abolished at the earliest opportunity. And I look at Parliament and I look at the last general election. I think was it 850,000 votes or something of that nature that the Green Party achieved, and we achieved 1 MP. Now that is a scandal in itself, and we ought to have dozens of MPs in Parliament on the basis of our electoral support. So I think we at least justify a few more places in Parliament on the basis of how people actually voted. So there is loads wrong with our democracy. We want to end the first past the post system. I mean, I've been elected under the first past the post system 6 times, and I think even I think that's wrong. You know, I think I ought to be elected by a proportional representation system. So yes, there is loads wrong with the House of Lords. Yes, we deserve places in Parliament, and I understand the Scottish Greens position. I think there's probably, you know, being Scottish and wanting independence, there's a slightly different nuance to the answer to that. But I know the work that Natalie does, and the work that Jenny does. If those voices weren't there, things would not be being said. And so we need people in there who are going to be putting the Green case strongly forward and making sure that all those other people who happen to be there by whatever reason are not the voices that drown us out.
Thank you, Andrew. And then finally, Molly, how do you square being part of a party of radical democracy whilst wanting to take a seat in an elected upper chamber?
I don't think that's easy to do, and I didn't take that decision lightly myself. And I asked myself exactly that question when this process started, which was actually quite a long time ago now, like 2 years ago. And obviously, I've tried to be an MP quite a lot of times, and I think I've done enough to be an MP several times over. But guess what? It didn't happen. And it's just so outrageous the way Greens are kept out of the political system in this country that I just don't think we can pass that power if we can get it. And the most obnoxious thing about any of us becoming a member of the House of Lords is that it will be in the gift of Boris Johnson. And that, you know, it just makes you vomit to think of that. But that is actually a way that we have a route to power. And because our policies are so urgent and so important, in the end, I thought, well, yes, I think we have to do that. We have to take that place. And so I'm putting myself forward for that reason. But it isn't an easy decision, and it doesn't feel comfortable to live in a country where you're kept out of the democratic chamber and then you have to beg, oh, I nearly used a really rude word there, somebody like Boris Johnson to let you into the, you know, the totally unelected and totally undemocratic chamber. But as Andy said, you know, we are massively underrepresented in the two houses that make up our parliament. The Electoral Reform Society did an analysis of the 2019 elections, and they asked people how they really wanted to vote, and they allocated the votes if we had a fair voting system, and we would have ended up with 38 MPs. So everybody on this call twice would have been in Parliament. That's the level to which we're underrepresented. So I don't think we can then, sadly, and painful as it is to admit it, turn our nose up if we can get ourselves a place in the second chamber. But obviously, as I already said, it's absolutely crucial to use that platform to argue for strengthened democracy and to argue for a fair voting system. I've also said already that I would put down a motion to abolish the House of Lords, but I would also put down a proposal to change the way the House of Lords chosen. So I very much value the expertise in the House of Lords. If we think of somebody like Tanni Grey-Thompson or Doreen Lawrence, you know, they bring a very particular experience in there. And my own preference would be to have a third elected by a national ballot, a third elected from regions as they are in the German Bundesrat, and then the final third chosen by an electoral college for their particular expertise. And I think that would generate a very good second chamber. But lastly, I just wanted to say our democracy is at threat for all sorts of reasons that are much more serious than the House of Lords. The House of Lords is an abomination and an anomaly, but we're seeing democracy attacked every day by this government. So if the power of being a peer could help to challenge things like the prorogation and the politicization of the civil service and all that sort of coming skullduggery, then it is definitely worth doing that. And you can see from my work with the bad boys of Brexit and my fighting fascism work that I'm well geared up to do that. And that's something else, as I said, that would be a priority for me if I were to become a Green peer.
Thanks, Molly. And that last point you just made kind of leads us really nicely onto our next question, which has just come through in the chat from Doug Ruxell. So Doug has asked, if you were in the Lords during the Brexit process, what would your personal approach have been to scrutinising the bills? So they've also specifically asked for you not to say that you would have done exactly the same as Jenny Jones and Natalie Bennett would have done. They want you to give your own opinion on that. And I'm going to start with Andrew on this question.
Well, I think the important thing to do is to build a team of people around you and not recognise that you don't have to do these things yourself. You're in a privileged position in the House of Lords to be able to ask questions, to be able to go through legislation. So building that team of people who will work with you, I think is a crucial thing. The other aspect of this would be actually exposing the implications of the legislation that's being put forward to make sure that those things are understood. And so having a live blog that showing things that are happening to do with legislation that are coming forward would bring that alive to people. I think making sure that you're reporting on a daily basis about what's coming forward in the Lords would be important. And to be a conduit for people to make sure that their questions are asked, to make sure the things that people care about are put forward. Maybe the things that it might be farmers. So there are, you look at farmers and Greens aren't necessarily the people who often come together. But farmers are now quite concerned about Brexit and the implications of Brexit, and perhaps that is an unlikely alliance that we might bring forward. So exposing the implications, bringing it to the public attention, things which are going on, and being a conduit for people seeking to make amendments and ask questions.
Thanks, Andrew. Over to Molly now.
Thanks. To be honest with you, if I'd been a peer at that time, I would have done everything I could to make sure that the process that was being carried out by cross-party group of MPs to stop Brexit happening had been more successful. And obviously that went wrong because eventually the Scottish nationalists kind of thought that their interests were better served by having an election, and the Lib Dems foolishly went along with them, and then Labour blundered in. And I think that in terms of stopping Brexit, we need, that needed to be the focus. I always thought it was a mistake to try and amend it, because essentially once it had happened, our power to improve things was greatly reduced. And I think it was inevitable that once that election was called, we were going to get the 80-seat majority. And with that majority, it's incredibly difficult for the House of Lords to actually make any changes stick. I think that, I know that Jenny and Natalie have put a huge amount of work in on the agriculture bill. And obviously there's a lot of people in the House of Lords that are very focused on agriculture. And I did some work. Lord Teverson, for example, who's in my neck of the woods, did some good work seeing what the actual additional costs in food prices would be. And, but all of that evidence and all of that work, is any of that going to stick at all with an 80-seat majority? Because as we've already discussed, we live in this elected democracy, and the House of Commons has so much power. So I think if there were three of us there, I think we could share the turf better. Of course, at the time this was all happening, we only had Jenny in the House of Lords, who was for Brexit, so that undermined her ability to counter Brexit in any way, or even restrain its worst effects, I would say. Caroline in the House of Commons did exactly what I said, tried to stop it by working across party. But I think if we had three of us there in the House of Lords, then we could share the turf and we could really get into the detail of the different bills. That will be useful now, although I'm not sure how much we're really going to persuade this government to really change anything. But I would say, again, at the time, the priority was mostly constitutional. So focus on the statutory instruments, see the extent to which the ability of our elected representatives in future would be able to have any impact. And that's most true of the trade policy process, because actually, as Caroline's amendment in the Commons showed, in future, we will have far less control over our trade policy than we did as members of the EU, and our elected representatives have effectively given that policy away. So it's quite nerdy and constitutional, but I think that work, defending our political representatives against their future disempowerment, was also very important. And there were a lot of people working on that, but again, I don't think they had that much success. So I don't want to be too defeatist, but I think I just feel at the moment with this majority, it's going to be very hard to change the Brexit bills. And I think even at the time, the focus needed to be really on stopping it, because any form of Brexit would have ended up controlled by Tories, and therefore very destructive, whether we think about farming or tax avoidance or, whichever other issues are of concern to us. And that's the situation we're in there, sadly. So that's why the cross-party working to stop it altogether, which nearly worked but didn't, was so important.
Thanks, Molly. And then finally, Amelia on this one.
So with my work of co-founding Another Europe is Possible, as well as founding Greens for a Better Europe, at the heart of all of that work has always been workers' rights, human rights, environmental protection and peace. I think one of the core things that we did was to be unapologetic about our support for migrant rights and immigration. And I think with things like the immigration bill, that there's a point of working on policy, but there's also a key point of how you work on messaging as well. I think as Greens, we are so proud of our position on migrant rights and protecting the lives of so many people instead of using them as a bargaining chip, as is currently happening within politics itself, that I would have wanted to work in a far clearer way on protecting migrant rights, but making sure not just in the policy points of it, but making sure that there was clearer national messaging on that as well, because we've got an argument and debate to win there. And I've been working on that through campaigning and as deputy leader, but having a position such as being in the House of Lords gives you a different platform to have that voice heard.
Excellent. Thank you, Amelia. So we've had lots of questions coming through on the Zoom chat, but there have been more people watching on Facebook throughout this time, and we are still lacking questions from our lovely Facebook audience. So if you are watching on Facebook, please do pop your questions in the comments and we will pick those up too. But I'm going to go to a pre-submitted question now. So the question is, if selected, you will have a job for life, or at least until we abolish the House of Lords. Unlike any other position in elected office, both in the party and outside of it, nobody can get rid of you. How will you stay accountable to the membership and the wider public? And I'm going to start with Molly on this one.
Yeah, well, Andrew's making much of his an elected Green in the unelected chamber, and that's certainly a good way of staying in touch with people there. But I think that what I know from being an MEP is that people are not restrained in coming forward and getting in touch with you. So I think if you keep your channels open through social media and through the various media channels that you have, then people will certainly tell you what they think about these issues. So to me, that's always going to be the most important way. But I think the rather strange thing as well about being a parliamentarian for the Green Party is that you're taken to represent the whole country in a way. So Caroline, for example, is seen to represent the sort of 65 million people in Britain. And people, when I say, you know, we don't have anybody in Parliament from Stroud, I mean, people often say, oh, you've got Caroline Lucas, which is kind of ridiculous. But at the same time, you know, I think that there is that sense that we're supposed to represent everybody. So I think as a Green peer, I would follow the lead of Jenny and Natalie in terms of organising a newsletter and communicating with people and getting those contacts with people. But I think beyond that, I would feel a particular responsibility for the Southwest. I am a Southwest patriot, and I would carry on with the connections I've had, whether that's with the Southwest TUC or, you know, Southwest Farmers or whichever interest group, to make sure that I continue to visit their meetings and to speak at their meetings. I'm still invited to do that now, but, you know, I think as a peer, I would have greater status and more ability to get ins to all those various places where you can hear the views of people in the various interest groups. So I don't think it would be difficult to do this, to be honest with you, because I think people would want their views to be heard, and also they would want to be able to reach out to you. So I think it would be more a question of having the capacity. As somebody, I'd be working full time, but I wouldn't have staff, and I'd obviously have to earn a living. So yeah, I think that would be the issue, but I would certainly do my best, and I can give all my time to this. So I do my best with that.
Thanks, Molly. And now on to Amelia on this one. So Amelia, how would you make sure that you're accountable to the membership of the Green Party and also the wider public as somebody who'd be given a job for life that no one can get rid of?
So my priority has always been the party, and I think having a role like deputy leader is a very different responsibility from that. And I think having built my reputation that way, I hope that that accountability that's been highlighted of people being able to contact me, meet me, be available is vitally important. But I also think that relationship building is vitally important within the party as well, which is something that I've done with building relationships with Jenny. Obviously, I've worked very closely with Natalie, as well as Caroline in different ways. And I think that's a key part of scrutiny, is making sure that you've got those representatives who are elected to represent the party in different ways, to be there to hold you to account as well. And in terms of that national perspective, as I said, I've travelled the length and breadth of the country, and that includes Scotland and Northern Ireland. I've done some work on speaking out on reproductive rights, as well as speaking out against the DUP in my role as deputy leader, to make sure that we are looking at every nation in the UK and ensuring that we are speaking out from a Green perspective within the Green Party of England and Wales. And I think that also that knowledge as a result of devolution is also really important. But I don't want to give up on that work. I want to make sure that I'm still supporting the grassroots. I'm still in communities, because that's where politics happens. That's where real lives happen. And I believe that's where politicians should be if they claim to represent people, or in this case, our party.
Thanks, Amelia. And then finally on to Andrew on this one.
Of course, if we abolish the House of Lords, then it won't be a job for life, and we'll all be free, and which would be marvellous. So a job for life. I mean, depending on how much chips and beer I drink, that could be sort of like 30 odd years. And I've been a member of the Green Party for 30 odd years, so it's quite imaginable, really, that amount of time, which I think is important. But the important point is being accountable to the membership, and I think, you know, at the moment we have people reporting at conference each year. I'm sure that Natalie and Jenny will appear when we actually have a conference at some point. That they will appear there, and there will be an opportunity to meet people from House of Lords. So that's one level, and I think that's important, but it's pretty basic. What we really could do with doing is having a House of Lords contact group, where you link with the policy working groups of the party and ask for their input on the work of the House of Lords. So a policy contact group would be a really great way of actually engaging the membership who've got specialisms in those areas to work forward. I think it'd be important to have at least a monthly report of your activity in the House of Lords, the debates you've been involved with, the contributions that you've made, a YouTube channel showing what you've done. I think some of what Natalie's been doing on Instagram with her 1 minute video clips, which I think is great and very accessible. So all those sort of things. And also, yes, Wally's mentioned the fact that I have constituents. I think I would also want to be, I would want to be referencing them as well and making sure that their lives, the way that Parliament is affecting them is brought up in the House of Lords. So that I represent a constituency of people on low incomes, a large Muslim population, and these are the people's voices who are often not heard. And so I want to make sure that happens as part of my work in the House of Lords.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all the candidates on that question. Those of you who have recently joined us on the Facebook live stream, you're watching Bright Green's Green Party House of Lords candidate hustings with Amelia Womack, Molly Scott Cato, and Andrew Cooper. We want as many people as possible to watch this hustings. We've still got about 35 minutes left of questions. So if you are on Facebook, please do share the video so that we can get as many eyeballs on it as possible and as many people can hear from the candidates as we can get. Also, please do add any questions that you have for the candidates in the Facebook comments, and if you're on the Zoom call, in the chat, and we will pick up as many of them as we can. I'm going to move on to another question now. So this question has come from Rosie on the Zoom call. So Rosie's said, the House of Lords is full of people who mostly represent the interests of capital, big business, finance, and so on. How would you work to raise the voices of working people and crucially trade unionists fighting to be heard in this space? So I'm going to start with Amelia on this question.
Such an important and powerful question, especially at this point. And I think that this is what we're trying to challenge as Greens. Who's got the power, who's got the messaging, and making sure that we're holding it to account. I work with trade unions and grassroots organisations, not just through my role as Deputy Leader of the Green Party, but also with my role as co-chair of the People's Assembly, where we work across the country to make sure that we are championing the rights of working people, that we're speaking against austerity and making sure that we build a country that basically works for the people that create it. I think it's very clear that at the moment our politics is benefiting an elite. You just need to look at what's happened with coronavirus and who's set to benefit to see that there are absolute failings of our political order that need to be broken down. So I want to continue to make sure that I do that work, because I think that trade unions, I am a trade union member, trade unions are vital to make sure that we are representing working people, but also, as I said, it's by being on doorsteps, being out there and genuinely talking to people that you truly understand how politics and policies have affected people's lives and ensure that we are highlighting and scrutinising how that damage has happened.
Thanks, Amelia. And over to Andrew next.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I represent the News Award in Kirklees, and the News Award hasn't really got a bohemian fringe, it's not that leafy, I've got to say. There's some great, lovely places around it, but it is a mixture of council estates, large Muslim population, as I mentioned earlier. We have many people using food banks. We have a lot of issues and problems. We're very, very active in the area, and so when I would talk in the House of Lords about the problems of working people, the problems of communities, the problems of people who are marginalised, I wouldn't be. This wouldn't be some esoteric concept. This would be something that's real life that I can talk about. That is part of everyday experience. I'll be able to talk with authenticity about it, which I think is really important. And so that's one of the things that I really can bring to this. The fact that I do have a constituency, and Molly says I make a lot of it, but I think it's actually a really important point. And trade unionism, I fully appreciate the value of trade unionism. I've been on strike for 9 weeks. It's a long time ago now, but it was the trade union backing that really made the difference there, that enabled us to get through the strike, not starve, and achieve our impact and stay, which was really important. So I appreciate trade unions, and I can speak for communities.
Thanks, Andrew. And then finally, Molly, on this one.
Obviously, it's true that lots of members of the House of Lords are either there because they're aristocrats or bishops or judges or cronies of some form of government. And that's just utterly and totally outrageous. But to be honest with you, the biggest problem with the way the House of Lords works is that it's got far too many lords there, and most of them don't do anything. So the number of working peers is much smaller. And if you look at the number of working peers, actually, it's the Lib Dems really that are overrepresented there. And there are, as I said before, some really excellent peers. Martha Lane Fox, for example, does a lot of good work, and Ruth Lister on the social policy side. So the Labour and Liberal Democrat parties have put forward good people, and this is great because they'll be allies for, you know, to work with for whichever one of us becomes the next peer. And I know that Jenny and Natalie have found some useful allies. So it's going back to something Amelia said earlier, it's become a bit bizarre in our democracy now, where it's almost like the people in the House of Commons are owned more than the people in the House of Lords. So I'm not that pessimistic about how that would work, to be honest with you. I mean, obviously it's true of a lot of the Tory peers, but I'm not sure how many of them actually show up, because it's like it's a sort of badge of honour for them rather than being something where they really want to get stuck into the debating, although I'm sure they're called in when the voting happens. In terms of the, you know, how do you represent other people there? Like the other two candidates here, I've worked a lot with trade unions. I organised, I mean, I'm a lifelong union member myself, and I organised a series of talks about the Green New Deal where we had people from the trade unions there, and also from the Fridays for the Future, the youth strikers as well. And I think that's really the way to work with unions and to bring them in. And I've been particularly impressed by the work done by the PCS on the just transition, and sort of harking back to the Lucas plan and getting working people to design how the Green New Deal might work. And I've actually put that forward to the APPG on the Green New Deal, or is it Green Growth, I think it's called. And I think that's the way to work, really, is to set up, to work through the APGs and also through meetings in Parliament, and to invite these people in so their voices can really be heard there. And I'm sure we've all been to events in Parliament in both houses where people have been hosted who come from completely outside that setting, and they're always the most powerful people. And I think, you know, both Caroline and Jenny have done some really good work inviting them in, and that's something I'd like to carry on. That's something I did a lot in the European Parliament, inviting people in as kind of tourists, but also inviting them in to participate, to watch the debates if it's of relevance to them, but also to be part of the meetings that we're having in Parliament, and then persuading the other peers who don't have contacts with these people to come in and listen to them as well.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks to all of our candidates on that question. So I'm going to go to a question which will partially draw on some of the things that have just been said there. But before I do, I wanted to give a big shout out to the folks in Blackpool Green Party who have been very diligently and not diligently, very aggressively, not that word either. They've been sharing the video to the live stream very thoroughly is the word I'm looking for, and bringing lots and lots of people onto it. So thank you to Blackpool Green Party and all the folks there for that. And I'm going to go to I guess something of a Green Party celebrity from the northwest of England for our next question on Facebook. This comes from Tina Rothery, who's got two questions, but they're linked. So Tina's asking, do the candidates believe they can work with other members of the House of Lords to achieve goals, regardless of their party? And secondly, how could you help make cooperation happen between different members of the House of Lords? I believe it was Amelia who went first last time, so I'm going to go to Andrew to go first on this one.
Yeah, I of course believe that I can work across party, and not just believe, but I actually have done it for nearly 20 years on Kirklees Council, which has been a hung council, about the 6th, 7th largest council in the country. And we've had Labour administrations, minority administrations, we've had Lib Dem minority administrations, and Conservative minority administrations. And the Green councillors there, I say, are the most successful group on the council. They don't laugh anymore when I say that, because it's true, because we've used the political power we've had and the leverage that we've had there to be able to do quite a lot of things. The very first ever free solar scheme in the country with no upfront costs, and that was a national award winner. And so some of that is about political leverage, but a lot of it is about having the ideas and recognizing opportunities and working with others and using persuasion to do that. And so yes, I can work across party. Yes, even with the Tories, I've done that, which that costs them a lot. There we go. So the other area where I've worked across party is the EU Committee of the Regions, where it's pretty much like the European Parliament, but on a local authority basis, on a regional authority basis, with 350 across different political groups. And I've had 2 opinions that have been adopted at the Committee of the Regions, working across party, gaining consensus on things. That this was the stuff that I took to the UN climate talks there. And so, yeah, there is a balance between, I think, persuasion and just being persuasion and actually making sure you achieve real difference. That's the important thing, to make sure that you actually achieve objectives. So, yeah, I can do it.
Thanks, Andrew. And it's Molly next on this one on cooperation.
I think this is exactly the right question, because as we already discussed, the House of Lords works in a much more cooperative way. In fact, you have to be much more polite to other peers than you witness in the House of Commons. And so it's absolutely essential to be able to work with other people. Like Andrew, I work in an area where sadly we have an awful lot of Tories. I mean, Gloucestershire is true blue, and the Southwest as a whole, because of our crappy electoral system, has mostly Tories who win under first past the post. So I've certainly had quite a lot of experience of them. But here in Stroud, I managed to negotiate a deal with the Labour and Liberal Democrats so that we had a pre-election pact, and then afterwards I had to sort of take power from Tories, which was, one of the highlights of my life, I've got to say. And yeah, that was obviously about learning to work with other parties who can be incredibly tribal and just not trust you at all. And that's not something we suffer from as Greens. So I think we'd all be able to do this. The problem is, how good would they be at doing this? And I think they're having some authority really helps, because, when I've worked with people from other parties, I think they work with me because they respect what I know. And so if we think of the example of the sustainable finance legislation I was talking about earlier, I brought that issue into the European Parliament with an initiative report that I persuaded the bigger groups to put into the Parliament and to spend our time on. And then because I had that knowledge of, and that expertise really in what sustainable finance meant, I was able to then negotiate and bring others on board. And in the end, in the report that I wrote, I didn't have to pull my punches very much, because I've been able to persuade people. And ultimately, everybody voted for it except a few of the Liberals. The Liberal group in the Parliament then is sort of split between right Liberals and left Liberals. Anyway, so only a sort of really hardcore market bunch, which was quite a small number, didn't support in the end. So I would say that's an example of cross-party working that I'm very proud of. And I think it is the kind of thing that's going to be very important in terms of the culture of how the House of Lords works. And just to say, I have already worked with some peers because of working on Brexit, and obviously, the opposition to Brexit was really led from the House of Lords. So I've had some connections then, and yeah, I would enjoy working with them further.
Thanks, Molly. And then finally, Amelia, on this question on cross-party cooperation.
It's a really important question. And I think that having worked cross-party as well on, as I said before, issues around women's rights and environmental policy, I've been able to communicate, to work cross-party with women like Jo Swinson, Harriet Harman, Nikki Morgan, to make sure that we're talking about our shared vision of how we make change happen. And I think that vision is really important, because I mean, we've talked about how we engage with different people, but also we have a radical yet rational policies as Greens. And that rational aspect is why people engage. But politics hasn't had a vision for such a long time. And I think that our Green vision is what's needed to bring people behind that as well. There's the way that you network, the way that you talk to people, the way that you appreciate people, to make sure that you get those policies on the table for a point of collaborative working. But you can, I think it's also powerful to have a clear vision that people can buy into and help make that change happen. I've also worked with groups such as the Conservative Party Women as well to do that. And I think that, you know, we have so many shared values for change, but it's vision that is going to make the Green Party identity, our unique identity, be heard. And what I want to be doing is ensuring that people buy into what kind of future we can create, not just for our generation, but for generations to come.
Thank you, Amelia. So I'm going to go to a question now that was submitted in advance, and this one is from somebody called Keith, who I believe is either watching on Facebook or on the call as well. So thank you, Keith. So Keith has asked, how will you use your position to improve the Green Party's representation in the media? And I'm going to start with Molly on this one.
Well, obviously, I've thought a lot about media because I'm also standing to be GPEC's External Communications Coordinator. And so I think the reason I'm standing for that post is because I worked out how to get more coverage in the media while I was an MEP, and I'd just like to share that more widely. And so I don't think it's really that complicated. I think it's about being strategic and identifying your issues and building relationships. So, as I already said, I would focus on particularly economy issues, and obviously the journalists will come to you about the issues of the environment and climate change and so on, but you need to go to them for issues where they don't cover us as much, and that's something I'd like to do to expand our coverage in the media, so we're not just limited to the sort of narrow range of issues. Now, when I started out as an MEP, I really didn't have very much confidence in the media or very much trust in them. And I think quite a few Greens are like that. But over the next couple of years, I basically worked out how they worked and that they're people just like everybody else. And what they're looking for is a story. And so I learned how to make whatever I was doing into a story that was relevant to them. And I think of this as being a little bit like Cluedo. You know, you need the sort of right issue at the right time with the right hook. And yeah, I would say that's something I've learned how to do over the past 5 or 6 years. And I was getting a lot of media towards the end of the time. And that was basically because I learned how to play the game, which is quite an interesting game in a way. I would also say that one of the things that I do when I'm doing media is I try and use this sort of voice of reason approach. And I know that when I first started and I was quite nervous, I used to think, you know, I don't want to sound defensive and I don't want to sound aggressive. And I think it's quite easy to do that as a Green if you're thinking that you're miles away from the mainstream. But I never think that about Green policy. I think Green policy is totally common sense. And so I adopt this kind of voice of reason tone when I'm doing it. And after I started doing that, people would sort of put on Twitter, oh, you're the voice of reason on this, Molly. And I think, yeah, that's really working. But I think it's a question of confidence. It's a question of knowing the detail. But it's also a question of just thinking that our policies are totally right and they shouldn't be considered fringy, and just rejecting that sort of prejudice that journalists sometimes have, that we're somehow the yogurt weavers. Nothing could be further from the truth. As I already said, we were closer in our policy to the FT's positions than any of the other groups I work with in the European Parliament. So I think it's a question of being strategic, choosing your issues, setting up the story right, making relationships with the right journalists, and I've already got lots of those relationships, but also having the confidence to really put our line down. Radical line, but with that confidence that it's it should be the mainstream, and assuming it is the mainstream in terms of your tone.
Thanks, Molly. So I was going to go to Amelia next, but Amelia's just messaged saying that she's having some bandwidth issues. Are you able to hear and talk, Amelia?
I think it might have started to stabilise, but do say if I just go a little bit roboty.
That sounds great.
media is really core to making sure that we're not just in an echo chamber and ensuring that more people hear what our message is. I've worked with media across the country and built up those networks. As has been said, people come to me on issues such as flooding, climate change, more recently on things like fox hunting and making sure that as well as anti-austerity positioning as well. We also need to be imaginative. As I said before, I've recently worked with artists to challenge why we need a universal basic income, and that's got far wider press than I think we could have done if we were just talking about universal basic income alone. I have an op-ed on the horizon for that, as well as some other opportunities. By being imaginative and thinking about where our policies are relevant, how they're relevant, and how we make sure they get them heard. We also need to be making sure that we're taking advantage of things like social media. Obviously, press do pick up on policy points from there. And I think that the kind of clarity of making sure that we're using all forms of social media through video, graphics, as well as making sure that we are getting our message out there, not just for the media, but for our members and for ordinary people. These are platforms that we have ourselves. And I think that building up our strategy on that is also vitally important. I've done media across the board where you wouldn't expect us to be, with having done CNBC as well as other news outlets that aren't kind of typical for Greens. And I think that that's really important about how we widen that net, and having that clear strategy about our long-term goals and ambitions. More recently, I've had some work on road building, which unfortunately hasn't come out because of the fact that there were more elections last year than we were expecting. But that's how we build a long-term strategy and long-term messaging, but make sure that we react and adapt to what's happening in the news and media at the time to ensure that our unique green message is heard. And I want to continue to kind of use the channels where I've done that effectively, imaginatively, and successfully.
Thank you, Amelia. Finally, Andrew, on this question.
Okay, well, I've got quite a lot of media experience as energy spokesperson. I've appeared on the BBC climate change debate. That was an all-party spokesperson. I was there with the spokespeople from Lib Dems, Conservatives, Labour, and didn't give too bad an account of myself. I think it was available on YouTube to have a look at if you want. I mean, of course, one of the things we will be doing is we'll have standard journalists that we'll have our links with, Roger Harrabin, these sort of people, the people who deal with environment and those sort of characters who you would normally expect us to have a relationship with. But I do think there is a huge neglected and missed opportunity for the party, and that is the specialist and trade press that deal with areas that we really should be getting a better profile in. And the sort of things I'm thinking of are things like publications like Energy and Buildings Industry, publications like Housing Today, the people who are the policy and thought leaders of those particular professions, and we don't get enough stuff in those. And those should be our allies. Those should be the people who are looking to us and saying, this party is the one that's at the cutting edge. This is the party that's doing that. So that's an area of media that, as a party, we neglect, and we should do a lot more. Quite apart from anything else, because by having a higher profile there, I think we can help establish a wider alliance for the party's interests. And so that's something that I want to do more of as energy spokesperson. I've already done some things on that, but I think we can do an awful lot more on that area of work. Another thing, it's great being Northern, and one of the great things about Northern, and there are so many things I've got to tell you, is that BBC Breakfast is based in Manchester, and so I've been down to the BBC Breakfast on a number of occasions. Yes, it was to talk about dog control orders, which was a bit boring, but I've been down there and been accessible and being able to go on the sofa during the times when we can go on sofas is great and useful. And I've been there. I was also there talking about our 2015 General Election Manifesto as well. So that they do appreciate somebody being able to get there and actually be there physically in person. And so that's an advantage of being Northern.
We do have TV studios in the West Country, Andy. I know you find that hard to believe.
Yeah, but not BBC Breakfast. Not BBC.
I'm sure
It's in
Amelia will
Salford
also
anyway, isn't it? Not Manchester. Sorry, I'm just responding to what Chris said, that we're allowed to interrupt
go ahead.
each
Yeah.
other. No, I'm only joking.
And I was just going to say, I'm sure Amelia would like to interject and say there are TV studios in Wales as well.
Always a boundary between Salford and Manchester, Molly.
And there are also trains, which I am definitely missing at the moment, having spent quite a significant amount of my Green Party life on them.
Great, thanks all for that. So we've got about 15 minutes left of questions. So if you have something burning that you've been wanting to ask the whole way through this hustings that you haven't yet managed to put into words and put in the chat or in the Facebook comments, please do so now. We're going to try and get through as many of the last few questions as possible. So there's a question that's sort of been bubbling around the leadership and deputy leadership elections, but hasn't really spilled out into the House of Lords contest just as of yet. And that's the question as to whether or not the Green Party is a party of the left. So I'm going to go to Amelia first and ask you, do you think the Green Party is a left-wing party?
As I said before, our policies are radical yet rational, and they appeal to so many people because they disrupt a status quo. It means that we have a long-term vision. I mean, essentially what you've done as members is create a vision for the future, and then we make a manifesto that is simply the stepping stones to getting there. Those policies are about people. They're about planet. They're about disrupting an economic order that simply doesn't work for people or planet. I always see our economy as it's kind of an upside down triangle. You've got the environment at the top. It's people that turn that environment into the goods and resources that make business and therefore make the economy. Our policies create all of that. They are left-wing policies. I am an eco-socialist, and I think it's important that we have that point of recognition that our policies are left-wing, but they are rational at the same time. They are about communities, they are about people, and I think that rational aspect is why we engage so many people. Yes, they might not be people that want socialism to be branded as a socialist, but that just proves that our policies are the strongest, the best, and the ones that build a better future for everyone.
Thank you, Amelia. So, Andrew, is the Green Party a left-wing party?
Well, I remember the Tory leader of Kirklees Council at the time stood up in a council meeting and he said, "Councillor Cooper is nothing but a dangerous socialist." And I said, no, you're wrong. I'm much worse than that. And that was really because he regarded that as a bad thing. And I come to a lot of the same conclusions as socialists a lot of the time, but what my politics philosophically comes from anarchism and anarchist philosophy, and that was when I was a politics student. That's where I took my lead, and obviously there's a lot of similarity with socialists and overlaps with socialist thinking. We are the party that challenges capitalism. We're the party that challenges big business. We're the party that challenges economic growth. I think under any of those particular measures, we would regard as a left-wing party. But having said that, I mean, I think one of the things has been said, that we do appeal to a broad section of people, and we shouldn't. If somebody lives in Milton Keynes, on a well-to-do estate, etc., or something, we mean as much to them as somebody living in the Bohemian fringe of Brighton, and so we've got to look at making sure that our policies are attractive to people across that spectrum, and so people understand that we're not putting ourselves into a niche which makes us inaccessible to people. And I think that's something the Green Party needs to do a lot more of, is thinking about how others see us. And there's been some interesting work being done about the Bristol election campaign, how we were seen by voters in England, and some of the reasons why we didn't break through there last time. And some of that is about how people regard the party. And there's some interesting things to learn from that to make us more accessible to a wider group of people.
Thanks, Andrew. And finally, Molly, on this one.
This is obviously a PhD thesis, so I'll do my best to focus on the most important aspects of it. So just to say that the after the first book I published myself, which was called 7 Myths About Work, the first book somebody else published that I wrote was called Market Schmarket. So I think that gives you a little hint about, you know, my view of where my economics is coming from. But having said that, I've always rather liked the Green Party slogan, not left, not right, but ahead. Obviously, you can't use that slogan because it's unbelievably smug. But I think what it's trying to say is that the idea that life has to be a struggle between capital and labour is the 19th century argument. And I think that this is the problem with our two-party system. We've got two parties, Labour and Conservatives, who are both stuck in that same struggle, one on the Labour side, one on the capital side. And as Greens, we've got a much more radical proposition. We say, you know, you shouldn't be a wage slave. You should be able to live even if you don't choose to work. So we have a basic income, and we, you know, we make claims on resources, we make claims on ownership that unfortunately the traditional left has failed to make. So I see us as an infinitely more radical proposition than the traditional left. I spoke at an event recently where we launched Mariusz Ostrowski's book called A Progressive Future for the Left or something. And it was really interesting to me because he defined the left, he defined basically, you know, there's capitalist oppression, and the left are people that stand with the people who are the victims of capitalist oppression. And on that basis, I think the Green Party is wholeheartedly left. But I'm a little bit concerned that this left-right thing is breaking down because it's, again, I'm intrigued by the idea of the second contradiction of capitalism. And I'm speaking with John Bellamy Foster on the 2nd of August with Green Left Unity Wales about this issue of, you know, what do the Greens have to offer in terms of that, in terms of a world where capitalism is effectively destroying its own support base, which is the environment, as well as destroying its own ability to function because of alienating workers. So I think there's a lot that Greens and left have. The left, I think there's lots of ways in which we are part of the left, but I also think as Greens we've got a much more radical proposition, and we shouldn't lose that and just get swept along in the same sort of policies that the traditional left adopt. And I would say fundamentally, the two crises are clearly the same crisis. The crisis of the exploitation of people is just the other side of the coin of the crisis of the exploitation of the planet. And I learned that very strongly by working with an indigenous woman called Lolita Chavez, who we put forward for the Sakharov Human Rights Prize in the European Parliament. She's a Guatemalan human rights campaigner. I don't know if you know, but hundreds of people are killed for campaigning for land rights in Latin America. It's one of the highest death rates of any human rights campaigners anywhere in the world. She's an incredibly brave and inspiring woman, and she came to the Green Group in the European Parliament and talked about land rights in a way. I mean, you know, Philippe Lambert's was reduced to tears. The room was all reduced to tears. It was so amazing to hear somebody speaking so clearly about what we've been, you know, what our politics stands for. And that's why I really value Green. To me, it's a kind of deeper thing than just workers' rights. It's also understanding that connection between protecting the earth and protecting people, and how we have to do those two things simultaneously. So yeah, obviously I could go on about this all evening, but I won't bore you any longer. Hopefully that's enough.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks to all the candidates on that question. So I'm going to try and squeeze in two final questions before we wrap up. So I'm going to ask candidates if they could be a little bit brief on these two final ones. So the first of these comes from Kat Driscoll on Facebook. So Kat's asked, as a Green peer, how would you ensure that your work is respectful of all Green national parties and remain accountable to more than just the members of the Green Party of England and Wales? So a second question on accountability, and I'm going to start with Andrew on that one.
So I guess a Scottish and Northern Ireland question. Well, with Scotland don't think we should be there at all anyway. So I guess it would be, we'd have to be tactful with it. And it may be a particular Scottish thing, but obviously I think we'd have to approach the Scottish Party and ask how they would like to work with us, and how we can actually make sure that the things that they're interested in, that they want to get there. And similarly with Northern Ireland, and it's talking to them about how they would like to work with us is the most important thing there. So I don't know if I'll go on about any more, so we can get another question.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Over to Molly now.
This is obviously a complex question because the constitutional situation with Scotland and Northern Ireland is going to change. As Andrew says, the Scottish Party don't want to be involved in having seats in the House of Lords, which I completely understand. and respect. And I'm already working with various Scottish Greens on issues growing out of Brexit and other issues. So, you know, I'd be very happy to maintain those relationships. But I think we'll have to think this through very carefully and keep taking soundings, because Scotland's obviously going to move into a constitutional crisis. It's already there, but that's only going to become exacerbated as the Westminster government refuses the referendum, which clearly most Scottish people want. I think that will come to a head after the Scottish Parliament elections next year. So that's going to become a very sensitive issue. At the same time, Northern Ireland is going to become very sensitive, because the Brexit relationship of having a border essentially in the Irish Sea will then put pressure on for reunification of Ireland, and the trading relationship will already be such that Northern Ireland and Southern and the Republic of Ireland have more in common than Northern Ireland has with England and Wales. So, you know, both of those issues are going to become very insensitive and going to change. And I think really understanding the sensitivities is going to require careful working, not just by peers, but by everybody in the England and Wales Green Party. So then to come to Wales, I mean, I'm at least half Welsh myself, and I lived in Wales for 12 years, so I understand something about the politics of Wales. I used to run the Wales Green Party out of my front room more years ago than I care to remember. But yeah, so again, it's important that we keep Wales issues on the agenda, but I think in the case of Wales, because we are the same party, there it would be important to have a representative from Wales Green Party that you worked with directly. I assume the peers already have that. If they don't, it's something that could very usefully be introduced. And I think make sure that Wales has a share of the issues that we're covering in the House of Lords, and also accountability via GPRC. So not just with the nations and regions of the United Kingdom, but also with the regions of the UK through GPRC seems like a good idea. I think Andrew already suggested reporting regularly to them, and that seems like a good way forward.
Thanks, Molly. And then finally, Amelia on this one.
So I've already built up relationships with the Scottish Greens and the Greens in Northern Ireland. And I think what's also important is making sure that we reflect on the elected representatives they have, not just their leadership, with members of the Assembly in Ireland and Scottish Parliament, as well as councillors who in Northern Ireland are obviously doing a hell of a lot of work of actually kind of delivering political change. But being Welsh, I'm from Newport, I live in Newport. I know the issues in politics when people simply don't understand devolution and what we're talking about on a political agenda, when often politicians are talking about politics that are unique to England as a result of the devolved powers that each nation has. I think if we're going to scrutinise government policy as Greens, we have to have that understanding of how devolution affects those policies and make sure that we are representative of that critical understanding of where that power base lies and who we're affecting. I think that those strong networks are important, but effectively, we have to respect those devolved powers when we talk about different issues, as well as when we campaign on different issues and when we talk about scrutinising policy.
Brilliant, thanks Amelia, and thank you to all the candidates. So we've got time for one final question that I'm going to squeeze in, which is going to be hopefully a very brief one, and I'll ask all candidates to be as brief as you can. The question, it's the end of question time, it's the end of the news, there's always a fun bit at the end. The fun bit at the end is, what are the characteristics you most admire in your fellow candidates? And I'm going to start with Molly on this one.
Do you know what? The first time I was on any questions, the joke question at the end was, if you got to the gates of heaven and you met God, what would you ask him? And they came to me first, just like you've just done. Anyway, I'm not going to say what I said because I wasn't very pleased with my answer. I would probably have stood there open mouthed. In fact, I think that was my answer. Look, the thing about this contest, and this goes for Rupert as well, it's not only that we're mates, it's that we do have a lot of respect for each other. And what really pisses me off, to be honest with you, is the fact that we're not all MPs and we're all fighting over one place in the House of Lords. So I know that we all respect each other. I know that everybody here would do a great job. In terms of, if I've got to name one thing, I think what I really value about Amelia is that she's always so positive, and I totally rate her networking skills, and she has built great relationships, which a lot of people haven't bothered to do with organisations outside the party, and I think that's really brought benefit to the party. And in terms of Andy, well, obviously Andy's just been great in all his local government work, which I've had a lot of respect for. I mean, you know, he stayed in my flat when he was on the Committee of the Regions, so we got to know each other quite well. So I have a lot of, I'm going to say he's got a good sense of humour, not to put him down politically, but because he has. And I think a sense of humour is always underrated in politics. But obviously Andy would be brilliant in the House of Lords because he's a Northerner, but not just that, but also because, you know, the sort of stuff that he knows about energy efficiency and, you know, and energy generally is exactly what people need to know now in the country. So that will be a really good platform for him to make his expertise more widely known.
Thanks, Molly. So Amelia, next.
I liked your sense of humour point, because Andrew always laughs at my jokes, even though I know that he thinks they're terrible. I really admire the work that Andrew does on mentoring and supporting people. I think it's something that's so vital in the world of politics, that we have that role, and ensuring that our knowledge and kind of understanding of how politics works is spread, and that we're supporting people who are maybe newer to what we do. And I think that with Molly's sheer tenacity is really inspiring as well. And I think that, you know, the work that Molly has done in the on a number of different issues, I appreciate that tenacity has been the only way that, as Greens, to be honest, tenacity is how you make success happen. And I know that that's something that Molly really has.
Brilliant, thanks, Amelia. And the last word on the last question goes to Andrew.
I really like the way that Amelia's beaten me in 2 deputy leadership elections. It's been, you know, humbling for me, and I really like that, being humbled so many times. But more seriously, Amelia has done great work with local parties, always makes herself available, gets out there, and that's important. And it's not always common to have someone who does so much graft and gets around so much, and has so many train tickets to show us during the deputy leadership contest. I'd kept everything. So there we go. So Molly, what can I say? We all love Molly to bits, and she's so good that she doesn't need your votes, actually, to be quite honest. You know, but as we know, she's a professor of economics, did brilliant work in the European Parliament, and she's a good buddy. Looked after me when I needed looking after when I first went over to Brussels and things. So yeah, oh, Molly, yeah, back her.
Stop it.
Good choice.
So on that happy note, I wanted to say a massive thank you to all of the candidates for speaking with you this evening. And a massive thank you to everybody who has given up part of their Sunday to listen to the candidates. We've had throughout the call more than 100 people dipping in and out of the hustings on Facebook, which is brilliant. Obviously, this call will still be on Facebook afterwards, so please do share it as much as you can. Get this in front of more people. It's going to be going up on YouTube as well. Your friends haven't missed out if they didn't catch it tonight. Before I say goodbye to you all, I just had a few final things I wanted to say. So firstly, I just wanted to say, for those of you who are relatively new to Bright Green, please do follow us on social media. The more people we get on social media, the more people we can get reading the articles that we put out, coming to the events that we host like this, and so on. So I'm going to be posting some links in the chat, and for those of you who are on Zoom, and for those of you who are on Facebook, there will be some links in the comments, so you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And obviously you can just come straight to our website as well. The second thing that I wanted to say was repeat what I said at the beginning. So obviously Bright Green is, it doesn't have the resources that major media outlets does, but it punches above its weight. The events that we put on like this and the articles that we put out are exclusively funded by small donations from wonderful people like you. We don't have big money or billionaire backers like so much of the rest of the press. So if you are able to, we'd absolutely love it if you were able to donate just a small amount each month and really help keep us going and growing. One final thing, if you have enjoyed this event this evening, if you've learned a lot, if you've got a lot out of it, if it's helped you know who you're going to vote for in the House of Lords selection, we have one final hustings coming up, which is for the Green Party leadership. That hustings is taking place tomorrow evening at 6:30, and there's a link in the chat to register for that now. And of course, we'll also be streaming that from our Facebook page as well. But we don't just want to give you that link. We want to give as many people in the world as possible that link so that we can get more and more people coming along to these and hearing from candidates. So there's a magical thing that I'm going to post in the chat for those of you who are on Zoom just now. This is a clicked tweet. So if you're on Twitter, if you click this link, it will create a magical pre-filled tweet for you, which will say, oh my God, I just had the most amazing evening with the House of Lords candidates. Come back again tomorrow for the leadership hustings. It would make me a huge amount if you were able to click on that link, share it, and we can get more people coming along. So one final thank you to all of our candidates, and a final thank you for all of you who have stuck with us from the beginning, and for those of you who've just snuck in on the Facebook page just now for the ending. I can see you, you're there. Thank you all for giving it part of your evening, and remember to vote in August for all of the Green Party's internal elections. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Bye, everyone.